Hey everybody, welcome to Clay Art Center. Right, so we just give it another minute or two.
Sure. Thank you everybody for coming to hear me speak tonight.
Should I show everybody what's on my table before we get started?
Sure.
You can talk about it.
It's an old one from grad school, maybe 5 or so years old, a little bit of gold luster. I haven't made those in a long time. I'm happy to see it. I should revisit that. I think I made a batch. The stems were too narrow. They all fell over, and I kind of just put them on hold for a little bit, never to return to it. So I like that. That's a soda fired piece, which is nice. A little bit of water etching and some slip trilling on there. I'll talk a bit about that later tonight.
Yeah. I thought you'd enjoy this blast from the past.
It's great. It's fun.
Okay, so I'm just going to kick off. I think we'll just let people come in. Welcome to Clay Art Center tonight. My name is Regina Farrell-Fagan. I'm the exhibitions manager at Clay Art Center, and we're here tonight to listen and share the work of Mike Stumbras, who is a former Clay Art Center artist in residence. Okay, so I just see a few more people have joined us. Okay, so going to hand it over to Mike, and I'm really looking forward to this myself tonight, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for keeping Clay Art Center close to your heart. I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Regina. I really appreciate it. Hello, everybody. I am honored to be here with you tonight to speak a little bit about my work. The purpose of this conversation that we can have today is about some of the historical work that I've been doing. I'm going to pull this up, do a little bit of screen share, some of my research as well. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I am coming to you today from Camden, South Carolina. I'm working out of my studio in Kansas City before I move, coming up shortly. But I'm doing some fascinating research, historical research here in Camden, historical Camden. And I'll talk a little bit with you about that towards the end of the presentation. So normally my presentation, especially in an academic environment, kind of goes through the things that I've done to get where I am. I think that I've made a little bit of an ambitious slideshow here. So I'm going to try to go through the first part of it very fast, just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of my background, and then really go to the meat of the presentation, which is talking about history, production, and practice, and my wheel-thrown pots inspired by 18th century European production ceramics. So I grew up in Chicago, Illinois. I first started making pots at Terra Incognito, which is in Oak Park, Illinois. Fantastic studio if you haven't been there before. I went to school for my undergraduate at St. Olaf College, where I got a degree in biology as well as studio art. St. Olaf is in Northfield, Minnesota, and Minnesota has a long history of Mingei aesthetic pots. And the Mingei aesthetic is a philosophy as well that involves the creation of pots for the everyday man, pots kind of by the everyday man as well, with a very austere aesthetic and a big emphasis on large scale production by individual artists. And that production is part of the reason that the design is to keep the prices of the pots low. You may know Warren McKenzie, Soji Hamada. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Mingei coming up, but this was drilled into me when I first started about pots being functional, utilitarian objects for everyday use. And it took me a while to get used to this idea, and it took me a while to kind of break away from it a little bit too, which I'll talk about here. After that, I met my mentor, Stephen Hill, who's a fantastic potter. I met him when he was living in Illinois. And after I graduated my undergraduate in 2007, I did a residency with Stephen at 323 Clay, where I'm currently the studio manager. Stephen made these lovely pots with slip. He took me all over the United States to see all different types of work, and I'm very grateful for his mentorship. He talks about pots in such a sensitive way, which is really nice. And after that, I did a residency at the Clay Art Center, which I'm honored to be virtually back here with. And my experience at the Clay Art Center really kind of changed the way I thought about my role as a ceramic artist. I had been doing a lot of teaching previously, but I always thought of teaching as something that I would do to support pot making, a way to make a living to support pot making. And what I realized at the Clay Art Center was after an exhibition in the gallery where they had students show their work alongside their teachers. At the same time I was preparing for my solo exhibition, I realized that the type of enjoyment that I got out of seeing my students pleased to see their work in a lovely space was really much more positive and pure than it was seeing my own work in a space, which I thought was my primary objective before. When you have your own work in a gallery as an artist, you're always kind of doomed to look back at it with a critical eye. There's always a should I have done something different? But this realization of seeing the kind of honest enjoyment that I got on that night from that exhibition of seeing my students happy made me realize that teaching wasn't a secondary part of my process. In fact, that the teaching of ceramics and the making of ceramics in my studio practice were really much more intertwined than I had given myself credit for and that I had really investigated. So at this point, it marked a transition in my thinking to being both an artist and a teacher and having those things inform each other. After my residency at the Clay Art Center, and one thing I'm not going to talk a lot about is it's a residency that didn't require me to get a second job, which most residencies do. It's difficult enough to get a residency as an artist. It's difficult to balance working a second job, which I've done for many, many years, and making pots. And I think that persistence is really an important and underrated thing about working in the ceramic field. During my show at the Clay Art Center, I had a solo exhibition titled Veneer, which I was dealing with the idea of both glazed and unglazed surfaces, as well as the personal life and the external life that you put out into the world, and pots as kind of personal objects. After that, I went to the Carbondale Clay Center, where I first got into soda firing, making work inspired by the beautiful terrain. And I went to graduate school at Louisiana State University, which was a really impactful experience for me. It's a great school, it's a great program, and it's a really interesting community. I was making functional pots, and I was making functional pots, and I was making sculptures. And I was making some more functional pots. And the purpose of grad school for me was to figure out how to meld these things together. Or how to make them both at the same time. And it was in studying 18th century painting that I kind of had a epiphany, a moment come to me. I won't talk too much about Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardonn, but he's a humble painter that only made 1 or 2 paintings, perhaps in a year. He was incredibly well respected, and he was incredibly hyped up for his time. In France in the 18th century, the Salon was a crowning achievement for a painter. And getting accepted into the, getting a ranking in the Salon and accepted into the Academy meant a stipend of a bunch of livres, a place to make guaranteed commissions and all this. And in the 18th century, there was a hierarchy of the types of paintings that people would make. At the very top, allegorical paintings, then historical paintings, then portraiture, then pastoral schemes, landscapes, and at the very, very, very bottom was still life. Everybody anticipated that Chardonn, because he was so hyped up in the newspapers, I got a funny story about that without enough time to tell it, expected him to shoot for the highest category. Here is a comparison of Chardonn with another 18th century painter, Jean-Honore Fragonard. And you could see Chardonn's comparatively modest dress, with other than the powdered wig and the festoons that say, "I am an artist." And when it came time for the Salon, Chardonn submitted this as his masterpiece, the Rayfish, still life, the very bottom. It was kind of shocking for its time. In reading this story, thinking about how Chardonn could be so respected and make so few paintings, and also could deliberately pick the bottom rung of the hierarchy of painting, it made me think that this was kind of a rebellious act that he did. And in thinking about this, I realized that making pots and making sculptures aren't really that much different. And if I would try to take a hint from Chardonn, what I really could do is spend more time on fewer pots and treat the pots in the way that my sculptors did with their figurative sculptures over the course of weeks and months. And I made this ode to Chardonn. This is a still life of a teapot, 18th century inspired teapot. The vessel is a strong theme throughout still lifes. And this is kind of a little bit in the Vanitas tradition. This is a self-portrait, features an element of death, a catfish with some gold luster, and shot this image in the kiln that the piece was fired in, soda fired. Now, I didn't get very good reviews on this piece from my committee, but nonetheless, I realized in the process of making it that I very much enjoyed the process of slavishly laboring over just these fine details on pots, and that really pots could be my calling. I was also living in Louisiana, so I was seeing plantation homes, which were incredibly beautiful architecture, a lot of 18th century architecture, but with a very, very dark and sordid history behind it, disgusting, despicable histories. I was seeing this tangible battle between the beautiful nature and the beautiful, beautiful nature, the fuzzy, was it moss, the wonderful landscapes, and also this violent hurricanes and floods that happened, particularly in the areas that were the working class and the poor class were affected. And that affected me. I also saw in Louisiana a wonderful combination of different traditions of different types of foods: Cajun, Creole, French, Spanish, slave cuisines, all coming together in amazing, beautiful harmony. And I also saw at the same time race riots after the murder of Alton Sterling, and political turmoil regarding race with redlining and deliberate disenfranchisement of people. And I was seeing these connections, the beautiful aspect on one hand, underscored by a really difficult and horrible past. And I was starting to think that in Louisiana, the past and the present are very much more interrelated than we think. We might say, well, it was bad before, but things are the way they are now. And this kind of disconnected approach towards thinking about history really kind of bothered me for a long time. I had loved pots like this. These are Josiah Wedgwood pots from the Wedgewood factory that I'd seen, have some type of relationship with these jasperware pieces from my grandmother. But I also realized that they represented this criteria for beauty that seemed a little bit empty in regard to contemporary concerns about things that were happening in the world. I did more research on Josiah Wedgwood as part of a way to inform myself about the way that ceramics in America has kind of been perceived, especially these factory-produced production ceramics. Josiah Wedgwood was first and foremost an industrialist and partly a potter. He's often viewed as a very magnanimous figure with abolitionist views. The literature that I've read goes into great detail about how he built schools. He built and paid for workers' homes, and he instituted factory reform in a way that we had never really seen it before, with serious division of labor, serious specialization, increasing mass quantity of products and improving the quality, and also being a scientific, hardworking man who, for example, invented pyrometric beads. But in studying more about the factory and this reform, I started to see there's a kind of a little bit of a darker underside to this, is that the building of schools was a result of Wedgwood's inability to train heirloom potters in Staffordshire, who families been making pots for a long time. They were reluctant to specialize completely. The schools were a result of trying to train students, apprentices from a young age to be able to work hard in a factory setting. And there's an amazing historical tradition of ceramics that was quickly leaving in favor of these fine earthenware, mass-produced and slip cast pieces. Wedgwood was also known as being incredibly authoritarian and controlling, with very harsh punishments for people. There was in 1783 a food shortage that resulted in a riot. Wedgwood, who was in London at the time, called in the National Guard and hung the leaders of the riot. There's also very harsh punishments for workers who committed what we would consider small petty crimes. A story of a young boy stealing sixpence from Wedgwood workers and being hanged as a result of that too. I think that this kind of period, the 18th century and the factory system, represents a very beginning of kind of some of our materialist concerns that we have in the United States today regarding social class, division of labor. in making pots, I realized that I have, and other artists who make handmade objects, regardless if it's pottery or not, have this wonderful ability to control the process from start to finish, which I think is kind of a rebellious thing to do in such a compartmentalized materialist society today. And I made some of these pieces that were treated with harsh firings from the kiln, the soda firing, which during the top temperature, a mixture of soda ash and water is inserted the kiln to affect the pieces deeply. With the heavy reducing atmosphere, it traps soot into the slip on the pieces, and it really affects them. This piece I call the sympathetic drip. This is a form, pierced urn, that was incredibly popular in the 18th century that is relatively obsolete today. The potpourri urn was so ubiquitous in the 18th century because they believed in the idea of the miasma theory of the spread of disease, where diseases were spread by bad air or night air smells, some ethereal quality of that would cause sickness. We know now that it's germs and bacteria, and of course know a little too well about viruses here in this day and age. And this vessel serves, a beautiful reminder of the past, also that serves no purpose really in a contemporary society. It lacks and it wants. And especially the drip here reminds me of kind of the crucible of the fire as a relationship to the pot. It is also a relationship to the kind of the crucible that we experience to become makers. The other thing that I saw is my purist background in Minnesota kind of eschewed the use of non-ceramic materials in the ceramic process. And I was surprised to find that when I saw some of these pieces in person, they're bolted together, which was a big no-no. They're also slip cast and made, and the specialization of labor that Wedgwood employed would mean that people would be trained for years to work on very specific parts of the object, the polishing, the detailing, the modeling. It means that as a solo artist, as a studio artist that seeks to control every aspect of my process, there will always be some type of lack in perfection, especially a lack of quantity. Make me ask myself, why do I make pots? This is the Wedgwood's porcelain vase. I don't think we have enough time for a discussion about this. So you can ask me about it in the comments if you'd like, or we can talk about it later. One of Wedgwood's most famous reproductions of vessel that was dug up in the 18th century that Wedgwood also kind of sold his soul for a little bit. He didn't like it, but he made it anyways. And so I undertook this idea of recreating and bringing these historical slipcast, mass-produced perfect objects into the contemporary age where they seem a little bit empty, and reproducing them, but also interpreting them is what I'll say in handmade ceramic in the studio process that that's relevant in American ceramics, with poled handles, hand-built spouts, and all wheel-thrown components. I also incorporate subtle elements, skulls, victory of death motif, and the victory of nothing motif to so that the work has an elegance from far and kind of a sinister, maybe not sinister, maybe a bit of a pessimism from up close. All wheel thrown and hand built. This large piece is on the left vessel is wheel thrown in 2 pieces and attached, and fired with these microcrystalline glazes that affect the surface. These are not soda fired. Recently, I've been doing content reduction. And a similar form to the last piece, a heart burial urn relates to the historical process of having the heart interred outside of your body. I make a lot of these heart burial urns with pulled handles. I think they're kind of fun objects, not necessarily exactly for the purpose of a real heart burial, but as a symbol of affections. I think Frederick Chopin's heart burial monument says, "Where your love is, so shall your heart be." His body buried in a different location. Whenever I do an artist residency or a move to a new place, as moving is so common and necessary in ceramics, I try to leave one of these behind, especially if I had a good time, as a symbol of my affections for leaving the place. A sad day, but also a great new endeavor on the horizon. I want to talk about some of my techniques that I use, and I want to talk about the history of those techniques and how that adds kind of contextually to my work. I don't think that a lot of these histories involved with the techniques would be just readily available, but I imagine that through a ceramic learner, seeing some of these repeated in historical objects kind of can click a little bit. And there's a little bit of a creeping of a context that comes through as you continue to study in ceramics. Thomas Toth. He was one of those families of potters pre-Wedgwood that worked out of Staffordshire and Burslem district during the early part of the 18th century or late part of the 17th century. You can see this is slip trailing here. I like to think of these as pack mule, wooden cart type of pots. These are made in mass. They're unrefined. They're made by individual artists. And these were could be considered production vessels for the everyday artist, but were much more tightly controlled by families and designs by individual artists rather than the outsourced design work that Wedgwood would do. A lot of these traditions have been around for hundreds of years and were they weren't lost, but they were beginning to be quickly replaced in Staffordshire by production technologies, and a little bit including Wedgwood and Spode and a variety of others that really were much more refined and were much more catered to the upper echelons of society and class. Thomas Toft died a pauper in 1689, was buried in Stoke-on-Trent, and this is like what I'd really consider pre-industrial work. What I am using in my pots is a little slip trailing technique that's really similar to English slipware that you'd see in Staffordshire. And a lot of that English slipware would show up, as we'll see, a little bit later in early American ceramics. What I like about this technique is that from far away, it gives you the feeling of being a well-resolved pattern. But the slip is so difficult to control that it really, upon closer examination, it really betrays the handmade quality of this work. It's really an undeniable squeezy process, which I think is speaks not only about class, but speaks about labor as well as the errors of the hand. Here's some slip after it's finished. I put a little bit of Helmer kaolin in my slip so that when it's fired in soda, it carbon traps. And even when it's fired in cone 10 reduction, it'll carbon trap a little bit, sealing some of that evidence from the firing process into that amorphous crystalline matrix of the slip and the glaze all together. These teapots are, again, relatively historically derived from that same era. The other thing that I like is this soda firing process. Soda firing was invented in the 70s at Alfred University as a way to replace salt firing. As salt firing was perceived to be a little bit more environmentally unfriendly or a little bit more dangerous. Soda firing grew into something completely different as it has its own benefits of salt firing, including brighter colors. But these are all Staffordshire area pre-industrial Wedgwood soda fired pieces with mostly made of stoneware. Wedgwood wasn't necessarily using porcelain, but rather a very fine earthenware. And to treat an immensely fine porcelain this way, which this is an English porcelain, with this rough process, that the process also, the salt-fired stoneware would be also, again, pack mule pots for the everyday use, almost disposable in some cases. To treat very, very expensive, fine quality porcelain in this method, it is another contradiction between social classes in this method. After grad school, I was a visiting assistant professor at the College of William and Mary in colonial Williamsburg, which is an amazing place with a very, very rich history. I got to study in-person ceramics at the DeWitt Wallace Museum. And I'd say that in studying historical ceramics, if you ever have a chance to see them in person, it'll be shocking how different they are from their images. I went here and Suzanne was showing me around the archives. I wanted to see a picture of this, what I thought might be a tulip vase, monumental shaped object that I found on the website. And I printed out a picture. I took it to Suzanne and I said, Suzanne, where is this? And she said, oh, it's right here. It's this room. It was a tiny little salt shaker. Seeing the quality of these objects and the impressions of the hand, if they are there in person, is really, really important thing to do. While I was at the College of William and Mary, I got a chance to do a little bit of research about the poor potter of Yorktown, which is a area just right next to Williamsburg. The poor potter is a really interesting story. He was neither poor nor a potter. And William and Mary's own Norman F. Barca dug up the shard piles in the sites in the 1970s. This work represents a let me see how I'm gonna say this. The poor potter wasn't poor. The poor potter, he had a major ceramics operation going on. And he also wasn't a potter. He was employing slaves as well as indentured servants to make this work. The reason that it's relevant towards American ceramics is because in the early 18th century, there was a moratorium on industrial development in the colonies. The poor potter was making pots that would be found as far as the West Indies. And he was doing this by making a stamp, essentially, that was a certification for the British Board of Trade that of the provenance of the piece, as well as the capacity of the piece. So I, in this project, replicated the poor potter stamp. But in my research, what I realized something that was much more meaningful to me than the legacy of the poor potter, a man that I don't think should be celebrated. What I realized is the quality of the shards that were thrown on the wheel, to see the evidence of the unnamed potters who felt this wheel move through their hand. Also, I was impressed with the quality of the work of the excavation of the site, which was done mostly by lunch staff, laborers, as well as students. This is an incredibly rare find, to find a piece from the early 18th century like this, to find both kiln sites as well as the shard site. Not many or any of the pieces of the poor potters survive, or rather the poor potters workers survive. So this added a really, really amazing, represented amazing research into early American ceramics. The reason the poor potter was called the poor potter was because he was subverting the laws regarding British trade. It was well known, the governor, William Gooch, was in writings, wrote to the crown, who got wind of a ceramic operation happening, and he said, "Oh, this is nothing to worry about. He's just a poor potter," which represented the systematic rejection of the moratorium against industrial development in the colonies, which ultimately led to the Revolutionary War. My pieces that I did for my exhibition there, Sojourn, were inspired by the poor potter story, but not by the poor potter himself. I was touched by the labors of those people who we know almost nothing about outside of occasional arrest records from the local pub. I was inspired by the quality of their labors, skilled labor, and still lost and forgotten. This is my garniture, which is a 5-piece set of pieces that go together but are not the same, for lost American labors. It made me actually emotional and sad to think about these pieces, especially when they became tangible in my hands in the form of shards. I got inspired by this process of salt firing. And in doing so, I made some stoneware pieces that were soda fired, an analog that I talked about. What I like about this is that these salt fired storage vessels, similar to the ones that in this last picture, would be in the back of the house. They'd be used by the help. They'd be used by everybody else. And then these imported fine earthenware and porcelain would be used as fancy dining pieces by the upper class that was systematically exploiting the lower class. I think that what's nice about these is that they highlight the contradictions, the strife between those two classes, and they bring to mind to me the way that these contradictions are still so prevalent and relevant today. Also, a little bit of blue cobalt, which you'll see is very relevant towards those finer porcelain pieces. And another soda fired piece in porcelain that I've been making. This is a recent pot. And I want to talk a little bit about soda firing. I meant to get in a little bit more to the technical aspect of soda firing here. I do have handouts for how to go about getting some carbon trapping, especially in porcelain. If you're interested in this, I'm probably going to talk a little bit less about the technical aspects of this in the rest of the presentation, because we're running low on time. But if you want some handouts that detail information that I have about slip trailing, including recipes, as well as water etching, which we're going to talk about a little bit, you can send me an email at mikestumbras.com and I'll provide those to you. Another piece that I really love from the 18th century is this painting by Hubert, The Imaginary View of the Grand Gallery in the Louvre in Ruins. Of course, the Louvre was not in the ruins at the time that Hubert Robert painted this, but there's this idealization of looking at seeing the ruins from the past and projecting yourself onto those in the future. There's a kind of beauty in seeing monuments and the structures that we have, knowing especially if they're oppressive, that they will be dismantled at some point. And if people looking at this is a picture of Apollo. I want to say Apollo. It would be very clear who this young man is painting, is doing a sketch of this sculpture during the time. We see pots being used in the background to cook with. Maybe not a view that's very positive of the future, but beautiful and haunting nonetheless. I like these paintings were called capriccios. I'm using in my pieces oftentimes the lost age, a designation for my work with these microcrystalline glazes that speak towards decay. They speak a little bit towards growth. They speak to the passage of time. And that designation lost age, I think, refers to the fact that these may have possibly been made in a playful way sometime in the past from a civilization that we're unaware of. Or also, since they are with knowledge made in contemporary times, refer to our own certain systems as lost in a different way. That kind of, I think, is funny. These represent some new underglaze work that I've been working on. I apologize, you guys, I'm a little bit tired today. We've been driving all day, but I'm having fun. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in again. I really appreciate it. Another technique that I've been using quite frequently recently is water etching. This is when I apply a resist onto the surface of the pots. I allow the resist to cure. Lots of different types of resist that you can use for this. I use shellac resist. Once it's cured, I rub it away, and it erodes the markings a little bit. My brush work is not great, so it makes them appear a little bit less contrived. It also reduces the weight of some of the pieces. On cups, for example, this will allow that porcelain to have that translucent quality that was so sought after for so many years. And it also mimics that erosion process that happens over the passage of time. I wanted to show a couple of contemporary examples that are really fascinating. Ryan McCurley does a really amazing water etching with paraffin wax, hot wax, and Jim Gattuso, that's a bad quality image, I don't know, sorry, does this with underglazes, does a slip inlay with underglazes over the top and wipes through that to reveal multiple layers of splashed high energy marks, which I think are really fascinating, really nice. After the College of William and Mary and some of my research with the DeWitt Wallace Museum, I took a position at Southern Illinois Carbonell as a lecturer. Sorry. I was making still some of these pierced urns based off of the miasma theory. And when I was an undergraduate, I didn't mention this, but I worked for the biology department doing taxidermy, and I got to exercise that. I get to do that every once in a while. I was thinking about this piece here, the ends of things, taxidermy rabbit, a wedding dress from a divorce, and a hammer with a vessel. There's very similar formal elements between the rabbit hanging and the color and the pot, as well as the color, and the studio hammer, which with some gilding on it, that's destroyed tens of thousands of pots throughout its life. A lot of artists say that the most valuable tool that you can have in your studio is a hammer for the purpose of editing. Here's some more heart burial urns with some pulled handles and a little bit of gold luster. I have a handout with some information about gold luster if you want. I'll put my email on the screen a little bit later. What's nice about this piece is I was playing around with slip cast bases that I made from historical molds that I would put on the wheel, and I'd alter them and throw them and have this kind of change, this bastardization of a slip cast piece, and then a very stubbornly wheel thrown object on the top in the mode of the studio ceramics that we all love so much here. I've been doing some 3D printing work, or I was here. This is a technique to make sprigs. 3D printed onto a flat surface, pioneered by Patty Chalmers, professor at SIUC. Wonderful. Oh, that's too loud. And what I like is that taking this deliberately, insistently, laboriously, slowly, handmade process, and then sticking a 3D printed signifier of the production that soon will that rules many of our lives in terms of labor. I think it punctuates it, not quite like a joke, but highlights some of the conflicts involved with that. By even if we dig our own clay, even if we're insistent on being in control of every part of the process, there's a little bit of futility there, because the supply chains that continue to bring us our materials, the supply chains that bring us our food and everything, we're so fully entrenched in that method of production that it's both rebellious and futile. And I think there's a kind of a beautiful contradiction in that. Here's a close-up of that 3D printed. It looks more squeezy and handmade, the 3D printing does, than even a lot of handmade processes too. And I think I kind of enjoy the irony in that as well. This motif, empty set with a laurel wreath, is prominent on a lot of my works. Laurel refers to academia in Italy. They wear it instead of a graduation cap. It refers to victory, as you see in the Sundance Film Festival as well. And so I'm creating a victory, essentially a victory of nothing statement on this piece, which I think is speaks to that futility and those contradictions. I also do a similar thing with my molded cameos on a deliberately unmolded piece. I've been thinking recently a lot about repetition and meaning, especially regarding the empty set motif that I just talked about. Here on the left, we have early 4th century BC Greek calyx crater. And then on the right, we have a 1st century AD Roman, the calyx crater, sorry, on the left, used for mixing wine. The 1st century AD Roman lawn ornament has a relationship to wine, as it has a scene of Bacchus on it, but it's a garden ornament. And then this was found later on, lots of these examples. Here we have a Medici vase etching, where this form takes on yet another meaning. And then we have a Wedgewood Cover Jar, so closely inspired by form, yet so removed from its original meaning. Like a game of telephone, repetition over time changes and changes and changes the meaning of the piece. And here we have it, the same for $63 from Walmart, if you'd like to get that. What I like about this idea, this repetition, it's kind of a divorce from history. And what I think is really nice that's happening in the American ceramics community right now is not just the rebellion from certain systems of production, but also kind of an insistence on supporting plurality. In a lot of these production systems, even in ceramics, we see this apprentice model where there's a translational transaction of knowledge, where the master tells the apprentice what to make and how to make it. And nowadays we have much more transactional approach to teaching, where in academia, the students' goals and their experiences are relevant towards the quality of the work that they want to make, where the teacher supports what the student wants to make. And I think what this has led to is a wonderfully diverse epistemology of ceramics, of methods of makings, of style of makings, of different concepts. And there have been, contrary to what many critics have said about that American ceramics community, that we ought to stake out some principles and get together about what's good. Otherwise, there'll be a proliferation of a bunch of different things, all unintelligible. I think it's the opposite. I think that supporting a wide variety of viewpoints and seeing, when I go to a gallery, a wide variety of different beautiful objects, some personal, some social, some political, some about nothing at all, is really, really amazing. And for this idea, especially in functional ceramics, I am, here's my empty set in Laurel. I like this idea of the empty vessel as the vessel containing not that meaning which it has to contain from historical sources, but able to be kind of liberated from that to represent what the artist fills it with. It's this process, controlling the process of creation from start to finish, the means of production from start to finish, and controlling the concepts of the piece becomes really impactful thing to do in contemporary society. And I support that fully with my students. Just some things that I've been working on here. forward to and solo exhibition that I had at Northwest Missouri State University. This is a garniture set with heart burial urns with the skull victory of death motif, as well as the empty set. And they're displayed next to the shards of pots that didn't make the cut during the creation of these objects. I am currently I mentioned, Caitlin and I have been driving 14 hours in the last couple of days. My wife, if I didn't mention, she's amazing. She's been actually doing most of the driving. I was working on work today in historical Camden, which is where John Bartlam, where the first porcelain in America was made. And I'm fascinated to do some more research. This is one of John Bartlam's pieces, takes a lot of inspiration from, of course, Staffordshire pottery. Also, he was a Staffordshire renegade. It also takes a lot from chinoiserie pieces. This just recently sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for £870,000, I believe. Don't quote me on the exact number. Far too much. The handle's broken and it doesn't have a lid. They are building a Staffordshire style bottle kiln here, which I will get to hopefully help out with, but definitely kind of observe some of the building of that. These are just like the bottle kilns that you saw at Etruria, Wedgewood's Etruria. Funny name, Etruria, as well, from Wedgwood, as the work that he was inspired by, the neoclassical work he thought was Etruscan, when rather it was mostly inspired by the excavations at Herculaneum and Pompeii, which was Roman work, we know now, which is fun. And we're going to explore, or maybe throw some pots with, some of the clay dug from the historical Camden Borough pits, which has been a vein of kaolin and other fine clays from the South Carolina area, which we'll hopefully get to maybe excavate a little bit if it's possible and throw with. We're also, they have here at historical Camden Staffordshire style pottery wheel, Bartlam style wheel, which I think is amazing. It would have an assistant that would turn the wheel while the potter throws. I'm definitely going to get a chance to work with this. That's the end of my presentation. I think the obligatory dog picture here at the end. So I'm a little bit over time, but we'll take some time for questions. I think it's probably okay if we go a bit over. The things that I've been enjoying most outside of ceramics is hanging out with my wife, doing a lot of cooking at home, of course. I love the cooking. We don't like to do the dishes so much, so that's not great. But a nice walk in the cemetery with our good boy Sam, who is 16 years old. I also do workshops. Here's my I love doing workshops. Now that we can travel again, please consider me for a workshop if you'd like, or online or otherwise. I hope to see you guys at NC if I make it. Here's my email, mikestumbras@gmail.com. Even if you're watching this recorded, send me an email. I'll send you some of the handouts that I normally send regarding some of those processes that I didn't talk about too technically. So I'm going to go back to me, back to us, okay? And I think Regina here will maybe field some questions, or I can do it. If you raise your hand, you can come on the screen in person. We can talk face to camera to face if you'd like. Otherwise, I'm going to go down here, and I see there's some questions in the comments. Nice to see lots of people from kind of all over. I just found Helmer Kaolin online. Now I'm curious how you formulate your slip. Use the same clay body as your thrown vessels and add a certain percentage of Helmer Kaolin. What I did is, to formulate my slip, I use Digital Fire as a glazed chemistry software. And I used to mix my own porcelain, which I thought was really nice. I got a recipe from Margaret Bowles, which turns nice and translucent. That is on my recipe handout. However, I don't have a clay mixer here or a vacuum pug mill, which I'm going to get one soon, though. That would be nice. If I had both those things, I'd mix my clay. What I did is I used both porcelain bodies. I put the recipes in Digital Fire when you can compare the rate of thermal expansion. And if that coefficient of thermal expansion is the same, it works great. The best way to make a slip is obviously just use your clay body, watered down. It'll shrink the same. You can add other materials to it too, but generally porcelain to porcelain's good. Porcelain to stoneware, no good. Any other questions from anybody here? You got me for 10 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Mike. That's just really interesting stuff. You have such a passion for your craft and for the history as well. You're about to take up a position as the ceramics professor, assistant ceramics professor. What are your hopes for what you can impart to your students over the next year?
Oh, that's a great question. I first want to say I am incredibly honored that I have accepted the position yet at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. There's graduate students there too. So the thing that I'm really excited about is having conversations about ceramics, expanding my own realm of understanding with speaking to ceramics people. You know, the grad students are so fun to work with because they know so much. So I'm really, really excited those conversations. The other professor there as well, Joe Page, incredibly talented and has a really wonderful rapport with his students. So selfishly, I'm looking forward to seeing my students in the coming years go out into the world and succeed like nobody else. That would be absolutely incredible. And I'm really, really looking forward to being able to support their understanding of what ceramics should be and what can be, their ways to succeed in the field, and the ways to find their voice in clay, which I think is the most difficult thing to do, is to find your voice. I hope that answers your question, Regina.
Yeah, that's great. So at your time at Clay Art Centre, we were talking very briefly before we came on air about working within the community and community outreach. Have you continued to do that in your career in any way? I mean, obviously as a teacher, you're doing that on a daily basis, but is there anything else that you like to do that involves clay with the community?
Absolutely. You know, I think that community outreach is a fundamental part of helping foster equality in ceramics. When I was doing the community outreach at the Clay Art Center, we were going through the BOCES program, I believe it was, into the local elementary schools and junior high schools that had not had any art education whatsoever. It's ceramics, especially for younger people, has the opportunity to teach creativity that even if they don't go on to be art, can be an incredibly valuable skill for society at large. And I think if we want to talk about having representation in the field between races and creeds and everything, ensuring that equal access to ceramics can be had in the first place. I'm just recently the studio manager here, and it's taken up quite a bit of my time, but before about October, I was a substitute art teacher, which gave me a lot of pleasure. And I was a substitute art teacher in a lot of those schools in the Kansas City area that are unaccredited and that have very minimal art programs. And so it just is really meaningful to me to be able to show students that they can be artists, because there's a lot of times not such a good reputation about it in the job field. In fact, this is another issue about valuing people in terms of the labor that they can do that I think is kind of just wrong, and that the support of the arts comes from helping kids in those positions. That outreach program at the Clay Art Center in New York is unlike no other. They have a dedicated community outreach organizer, I believe. They get a bunch of grant monies. Is that correct?
Yeah, we still run lots and lots of community outreach programs, and we're always looking for opportunities to affect people and get into the schools and bring people into Clay Art Centre as well. We just put up the work of the Around the World in Clay students today in the resource room, which was great. So yes, we're still very passionate about it at Clay Art Centre.
And if you are not at Clay Art Center and you're watching this, the picture of the Clay Art Center with that mural on the side of the wall, with the lovely mural with the tree, was a multi-school project to make ceramic tiles and fire them to put that. I'll put that all up with grout on the side of the building. It's just really lovely mural.
I was just going to mention to you, Mike, that recently, well, especially in this past year, people have been home and, as you say, cooking. And there's been a surge in interest in dinnerware again, but saw an article about it recently, more eclectic dinnerware, and younger people are going out and looking for old plates and old cups that they might have grown up with and using them in their home. How do you see the relationship between ceramics and the home these days, especially as you make such formal looking pieces?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that, ceramics have a way of enriching, of course, the ritual of eating, the ritual of dinner. They also serve as objects that can be more than that as well, I think. They can have a significant conceptual basis to them and still enrich those eating rituals. I love my collection of pots that I've assembled over the years. And it's like the process of picking a workout to use on a particular day, or breaking out the really nice things on a particular occasion. If I can't afford too many nice things, but I think all of that is really a wonderful avenue in making. I've talked considerably about my research-based work, but I don't mean to think that that's a method of working that's appropriate or comfortable for everybody. I think that beautiful handmade functional pots are just as meaningful to the experience of making and being, especially as people control that process from start to finish, as anything else. Thank you. Here's a question I see from Jessica Zhang. For research-based work like mine, what is my experience with others interpreting my work? I think generally very, very good. I'm in recent times have been very surprised at how well my work has been received. I think that not every choice that I make that I've kind of laid out for you here tonight is readily apparent to everybody in the work. But I think that the combination of techniques, as well as a combination of production inspiration and handmade choices, I think people get what I'm after about that. And I especially try to make a point to do lectures like this and things, so I can explain a little bit about my choices and a little bit about my research. But this is the age-old question, I think, of intent versus perception, right? Where does my intent in the creation of the pieces really stop carrying as much weight as the perception of the work by other people? And I try not to think about that too much, because for me, my studio practice is, I don't want to say it's deeply personal, but it's something that I care about a lot, and it's something I wouldn't be able to do if I didn't love it. But it's something that if I didn't have the ability to do it, I don't know what else I would do. And so it's this idea, the continuing to have ideas, continuing to say something as I'm like becoming more comfortable in the body of work. I'm focusing down on what I want to say with it. And for me, I think that's really important. Less important is that it's perceived correctly by anybody who uses it, whether it's a nice object or conceptually charged object. I'm very happy with both of those interpretations. Thank you.
Mike, have you any plans to publish your research or to gather your research together in any way?
Yes, absolutely. I am going to do about this week here in Camden, South Carolina. I'm going to take a bunch of good pictures and videos. There's also going to be a couple of digs that maybe we'll, or maybe not, find something. I think that'll be fascinating for publication, especially with some novel research. I'm going to be giving a panel with Southwick Briggs II about some of that for Antica. Hopefully, I've submitted a proposal for that. I've been, the last couple of years have been kind of wild, making the transition, a couple of rapid transitions very quickly, helping my wife finish up her social work degree, which I'm super proud of that she just did. Congratulations. She's here with me, of course. And so I have a bunch of scattered writings that I expect to publish in the next 10 years. Thank you.
That's great. I loved what you were talking about with the hammer earlier. I remember once a professor said to me, "Don't fall in love with the work," and people get trapped in the piece that they're making. So, what advice do you have for people as they enter into their studio practice, or how can you keep going and not have the confidence to move on and walk away from something?
That's a good question. It's tough because I still struggle with myself. I think it's like kind of part of our nature to do that. I will say what my mentor said to me kind of regarding that, something similar. He said, as an artist, you are always doomed. This is Stephen Hill's. I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't think he knows that he said this. Maybe he does. But as an artist, you are doomed to looking back on your work with a critical eye and always being dissatisfied. But as an artist, you're also doomed towards getting in the studio with excitement and expectation about that next thing. It's, a lot of us artists are sensitive, caring people, and that's maybe something that has an association with wanting to be a creative person in the very beginning. But it's very easy to get bogged down with making something and seeking perfection. I think in my work, I found that middle ground by embracing imperfection, and I make as many things as I can, as carefully as I can, and I try not to be too afraid of the hammer, and I try not to be too dependent on my own expectations. A lot of times I'll unload a kiln and I'll be very disappointed with a couple of the pieces in there because they look different and they look not like what I expect them to look like when I did the glaze application. And when they come out, after months pass, those end up sometimes being my most favorite pieces, and I decide to try to deliberately recreate some of what happened accidentally in those pieces. In terms of like everyday working and beginner students, almost always it's easier to make something new than it is to repair something. And it'll be much quicker and you'll get much better practice. And just in general, it will be better the second time around. My mentor also says, make more pots, not as a value production cost, but as this practice is an important part of the craft.
Just one of the slides you were showing there earlier with the piece that sold out on, was it Walmart? I think you had it on, or Target.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
The crater or campana urn, as it's been called.
Yeah. What is it about those forms that you think is so timeless, and you can walk around any neighborhood and see those reproduction pieces in people's gardens? Why do you think they're so timeless and that they still are relevant to us now?
It seems like people continue to keep returning to vessels in the past. I think part of the reason that they're so timeless is because there are many of those examples that were preserved very well because they were very prized pieces. Maybe, this is a tough question because maybe there's something about that shape that makes it like burn into the human psyche when we see it. Humans are different today, but not that biologically different than we were even 10,000 years ago. So I this is like, it's sometimes these things catch on like a meme where they're repeated because they're repeated in a way. That's really difficult, and I don't want to speculate too much about that. But part of me wants to just say that they just are, and it's become part of like the identity of ceramics, that object. You can think about that as also, the classic shape of a vase, or the classic shape of a jug. One of my 18th century philosophers that I really like is radical skeptic David Hume, Scottish philosopher writing in French, and he refers to a lot of the things that we believe to be truths as simply customary. And so this possibly is a customary object that is driven by chance, by custom, by reverence for tradition, possibly, and also by a deep misunderstanding of the traditions of the purpose of why that was made in the first place. I guess I don't know. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I wasn't expecting you to deliver a too close of an answer, but it's an interesting question. I just want to see if anybody else has any question before we close up for the evening. This was amazing. It was such a pleasure to listen to you and feel your passion for ceramics and for the research that you do. And very interesting, the relationship between labor and the ceramic traditions, especially coming out of like the Industrial Revolution and that era.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you'd like, I'm most active on Instagram. You can find me there, just my name. I've got some pots in the Clay Art Center gallery.
Yes, in our shop. Mike, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and for sharing with us. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Mwah!
Thank you, Mike. Bye. Good night.
Regina.